I'm Skye Jethani, the senior editor of Leadership Journal and Audiver.com, and the author of The Divine Commodity. I have a few minutes to talk to you about a turning point, and what I want to talk to you about is when it became clear to me that a lot of the work I had been doing in ministry was probably inoculating people to the real gospel rather than welcoming them into it. So here's sort of where it began to dawn on me. On Sunday nights, I meet regularly with a group of college students. I live in Wheaton, Illinois, right near Wheaton College, so these students gather with me on Sunday nights, and we primarily talk about struggles they're having in their faith. And one night they wanted to talk about the ongoing presence of sin in their lives and sort of what that means. So after a while, we went around the table and I asked them to answer this question. I didn't want to know what their sin was. What I wanted to hear from them was, how do you think God views you in the midst of your sin? So we went around the table, it took about an hour, and what amazed me was all these students gave more or less the same answer, and that was that God is supremely disappointed with them because of their ongoing struggle with sin. Now, what amazed me about that answer was that every one of the students present that night had grown up in a Christian home. Half of them were missionary kids. A number of them were Bible majors, and all of them, of course, were Wheaton College students, so they had had this entire evangelical upbringing. And yet not one of them gave the right answer. Not a single one of them said that God still loved them in the midst of their sin. And it made me start investigating, what are we teaching our young people and what are we communicating in the pulpit that people can go 18, 20, 22 years in the church and not get the right answer on something as basic as, how does God view me? So here's what occurred to me after a while of working with these students and investigating my own ministry. I think that what we've done is we've given people a vision of life for God, but we've not really given them a vision of a life with God. And there's a huge difference between those two things, a vision for life for God or a vision of life with God. Here's what I saw in my own ministry. As I began to preach a little bit less at my church and was spending more time in the pews, I was reflecting on some of my own sermons and what I've communicated, and what I realized was a lot of my energy in my preaching had been going toward convincing people to change their circumstances. What I wanted was for more people to stop doing more of the things they like to do, so that they would do more of the things I felt God wanted them to do, or really what I wanted them to do. So serve more at the church and do more evangelism and lead more small groups and all the things that sort of count for ministry. What I was doing was judging people and measuring people based on their circumstances. And those who could give more of their time and energy to doing things for God were better or more mature or more valuable to the church than those who were doing things that I thought were less important for God. Well, all of that is really ridiculous when you study Scripture. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 that each person should remain in the condition in which God called them, whether that's station of life or circumstances. They are to remain where they were, but to stay there with God. Paul's main focus was not, what are you doing for God, but are you living your life with Him in ongoing perpetual communion with Christ? This is why Paul calls us to pray without ceasing. I don't think he was using hyperbole there. He really wants us to be in ongoing, continual communion with Christ, no matter our circumstances. What I had been teaching people, and what I think these Wheaton College students had absorbed over their lifetime in the church, was that their value was really rooted in what they were doing for Christ. And so their primary reason for wanting to root out sin in their life was, well, sin was preventing me from doing all the things for Christ that I should be doing. And yet that's not what the writer of Hebrews says either. In Hebrews chapter 12, he tells us to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, throwing off the sin that so easily entangles. In other words, the reason why we really want to get rid of sin in our life is not so that we can do more for Christ, but so that we can experience more of Him in our lives, because He's the one that we fix our eyes on, not ministry for Him. So here's a big change that happened for me in my own teaching and ministry, is I realized rather than focusing my ministry on trying to get more people to change more of their circumstances to do more for God, what I really want to do, and what I think my core calling should be in ministry, is helping people get a vision of life with God right where they are. Even if their circumstances never change, if their career never changes, if their health never changes, if their marital status never changes, if their home never changes, if nothing ever changes, are they inspired with a vision of what it would be like to live right where they are, fully in communion with Christ? My hunch is that if more people lived that way, in ongoing communion with Christ, more things would actually get done for him as well. But that's sort of the challenge in our setting, is we tend to judge so much of what we do based on what's getting accomplished for God, rather than realizing what he cares most about is that we're with him. This is perhaps most vividly seen in the story of the prodigal son. If you recall, at the end of that parable in Luke 15, the older brother is upset about the party being thrown for the younger brother who's returned. So the father goes out to the older brother to convince him to come back in. And the older brother says something really interesting. He says to his father, "All these years I have served you, and you never even gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends." The older brother's really rooted his identity in what he's done for his father, and that's why he's upset. But the father gives him a great response. The father says to the older son, "All these years you have been with me, and all I have is yours." The son was focusing on what he's done for God. The father focuses on the fact that he has his sons, now both of them, back with him. What matters most to God is not what we do for him, it's what we do with him. From the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, where God walks in the garden with his people, to the very end of the Bible at the New Jerusalem in Revelation, where God is once again dwelling with his people, we see that with is really the center of the gospel. It's why Jesus came, died, and rose again, so that God might be with us. Let's not exchange that for a lesser calling. As good as it might be to serve God and do wonderful things for him in his kingdom, that's not the centerpiece of the gospel. And once we get that squared away and get that straight, I think it'll transform our ministry and what we teach our people. Thanks. I hope these few minutes together have been helpful.